today has a familiar name. I think you may know this parable that Jesus tells about the Rich Man and Lazarus. And normally, in my Bible studies and from the pulpit, I try to stay within the narrative of a given gospel. And when it's helpful to look at what the other evangelists say to add their perspective. And this is one of those occasions where, at least when I hear the name Lazarus, this is actually the second part of what I think of. My mind first jumps to the raising of Lazarus. We're reading Luke's Gospel, and in St. John's Gospel, chapter 11, is the pretty familiar story of the news comes to Jesus that his friend Lazarus has died, and he makes his way to the tomb where he meets Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. In English, the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. Not actually in Greek, that's a different story for another day. But Jesus weeps and raises Lazarus from the dead, right? You know that. Lazarus come out, and it's a nice follow-up to the previous chapter of the Good Shepherd where Jesus says that he knows his sheep by their name and he calls them by their name. He uses his voice and calls them. When I hear today's passage in the Gospel, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and especially at the end, he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. My first thought is, but Lazarus rose from the dead. And if you begin to read a little further in St. John's Gospel, you do see that that did not convince some of Jesus' adversaries. In fact, immediately after, in chapter 11, the plans to arrest and kill Jesus begin to get formulated. And almost worse, in chapter 12, we read that those plans soon include Lazarus too. They want to get rid of Lazarus, even though he's raised from the dead. I think sometimes, and I think this is true of all of us, and I'll use another verse from an earlier reading to illustrate this. There was another familiar verse. Lazarus is a familiar name. Jesus wept is a familiar verse. But we also heard another familiar verse from the letter of Paul to Timothy. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. We know that. So using money as an example, but it could be anything. It could be power. It could be holding on to our selfish desires, basically to do what we want for ourselves. Sometimes, and this I think happens to all of us, we can sort of get blinders on. You know where blinders, that expression comes from the horses, right? They put the horse blinders on so the horse stays on the same path, doesn't get distracted from the things around, and can just keep moving forward. And I think sometimes, whether it's wealth or our lifestyle or the power that we have in life or whatever it may be, sometimes those things can turn into a root of evil because we're blind to all else. And I think that may be what's going on in the gospel passage today, that this rich man had gotten to the point where his wealth was all that mattered, and taking care of Lazarus really was not something he was concerned about. And we see that again, I think, in St. John's Gospel, where the chief priests, their religious power was all that mattered. All that mattered to them was keeping hold of what they had, and even someone rising from the dead couldn't steer them off their course. And in fact, the only way they went out of their way was to make sure that anything, such as the raising of Lazarus or the ministry of Jesus, was stamped out, so they could keep what they had. That's one side of it, and I encourage everyone, I think we're all guilty of this from time to time. Be sure not to have blinders on that keep you from seeing God's work around you, in the people around you, in ministries that are open to you, in things that you can do with your life. It can be easier than you think to be overly focused on the life you're living and the path you're on, to the point where not only you might miss God, but you might actually veer so far off course that you're trying to stand out on. Be wary of that. Now, the other side of this, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that first part in a second, about the blinders and being caught off course, but the other side is it can be very difficult when you have been given some gift by God. Whether it's, in Lazarus' case, one does not know how Lazarus felt when he heard that they were trying to kill him again. Right? But he probably did not feel real good. That would be very demoralizing. And the same can be said for almost any ministry or thing, gift from God, any calling that you have. More often than I think we like to admit, we're encouraged by the Holy Spirit to do something, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ in a way that God has set before us, and challenges we never expected pop up in front of us. This past couple of days, I had what I would call the 3 days in the life of a priest. At the prayers of the people, you will discover, if you did not know, that my anniversary of ordination has just happened. It's my 18th anniversary of ordination as a priest. And later this week, on September 29th, will be the 7th anniversary of my institution as rector here. I've actually been here for 7.5 years, but I have 2 nice September anniversaries. I wasn't the only one that was ordained in September. One of the events that I went to yesterday was the ordinations at our cathedral. And it was wonderful. There are 7 people that were ordained and are now celebrating the Eucharist, I'm sure, for the first time in their respective parishes. I ask you to keep them and all who are ordained in your prayers. But immediately after that, and this is just yesterday, I went to the institution of the new rector at Bronxville. Bronxville is a beautiful church. Kurt Gerhardt is their rector. He's a wonderful man. And I invite you to keep him in your prayers as well. If you ever visit Bronxville, they have more incense than we do, among other things. But it's a nice place, and I hope you'll keep them and Kurt in your prayers. But that was just one part of it. So I got sort of the ordination and then the institution of a rector. But on Friday, I was at the cathedral again for the funeral of Canon Constance Coles, who was, for many years, the canon for ministry in our diocese. And what that means is she oversaw the ordination process for a number of people, myself included. And she died unexpectedly this summer. And at her funeral on Friday, there were people from really my whole history being ordained. Bishop Sisk, who ordained me, was there. All of the canons that I grew up with. The canon of the ordinary, John Osgood, the canon for transition ministry, and all of them. They were all there. And it was wonderful to see everyone, even in that sad environment. And I was reminded of how it can be challenging. When I went through my own ordination process, I told my father in 2000 that I wanted and felt called to be ordained, and he was the first of a whole line of mentors that pushed back on me. He said, "Do you really want this? Is this really something you feel called for?" And I think at first, and I got more of that from my discernment committee, and more of that from the Commission on Ministry and onward. And part of it is sometimes when you're called by God to do something, the pushback is actually from God and from those who are saying, "Are you sure you're prepared for this? Are you sure this is what you want?" And so I do think sometimes, in the case of Lazarus, the pushback was fairly horrible. But sometimes the pushback is for our own good. When you are called to something in ministry, know that there will always be pushback. Know that some of it is healthy. Know that some of it is not. But pray for courage and patience in those times, because it is always difficult to do ministry. And I'll give you an example of one that we can do really in the very near future. I didn't know until what time is it now? 45 minutes ago, that I guess I hadn't paid attention to the news because I was at the cathedral so much. But you know Orchard Beach, right? Orchard Beach is right near us. One of the beautiful things about being in Pelham is we're sort of this little triangle, this church right next to New Rochelle, right next to the Bronx. We draw from Mount Vernon all over Westchester, Pelham, New Rochelle, the Bronx, and around the corner is Orchard Beach. And you may remember 2.5 years ago when they first set up at the beginning of the pandemic with the containment zone just down the road. And then they set up the testing center to Glen Island and then the other giant one at Orchard Beach. Orchard Beach is being used again. They're setting up for 1,000 asylum seekers who are basically refugees just down the road from us. I didn't know that until 45 minutes ago. I actually had to check my phone to see, how did I miss this news? I think the good news for us, other than our location, for the record, we might not be the closest church to Orchard Beach. Perhaps Grace City Island is closer, but we are as close as anyone else. If there is ministry to be done at Orchard Beach, if not us, then who? If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We are blessed not only by our location, but we actually have some experience in this. For the past 3 or 4 years, our parish has been involved in Hearts and Homes for Refugees. I thought that was hard work, godly work, but hard work, dealing with a family or an individual trying to resettle people, children of God who have been forced from their native land into ours and are simply looking for a loving home and a loving heart. Our sequence hymn actually says it better than I ever could about what ministry means to the stranger and those seeking a home. Where all is doubt, may we sow faith. Where all is gloom, may we sow hope. Where all is night, may we sow light. Where all is tears, may we sow joy. It's the prayer of St. Francis. I don't know how we can minister at Orchard Beach. I really have no idea. But I know we have some practice at helping resettle refugees and ministering. And I invite and encourage you to pray and to think how we can help. How we as a church family and community can help a child of God. There are 1,000 coming through. I don't know what we can do. It may just be that we can offer our prayers. But I hope we can do more. And I encourage you to pray over that in the coming days and the coming weeks. Because we are called to ministry. We are called to love our neighbor as ourselves. We are called to love the stranger as ourselves. And circling back to this gospel, it can be very challenging when you embark on a new ministry. There will be people that will say, it should not be us. It should not be you. It should not be me. But I do believe God is pushing us by the very fact of our location and the fact that we have already experienced doing this, to do what we can. Pray over that and think over that. And when the pushback comes inevitably, whether it's in your heart or from your friends or from your family members or wherever it comes from, pray through that and remember always that we are commanded by Jesus Christ of only one thing: to love one another as he loves us. He gave himself for us on the cross. And we are commanded to give ourselves in service to others, our neighbors, the stranger, even our enemies. How are we going to do that? It's a question we'll answer in the coming weeks, I think. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.